Ouais, peut-être un petit mot d'introduction pour dire déjà que c'est un honneur de vous recevoir à l'Assemblée nationale française. Donc Pavlina Tcherneva, vous êtes professeur agrégé d'économie et chercheur. Vous êtes la spécialiste mondiale sur la question de la garantie à l'emploi, notamment autrice du livre « Les arguments en faveur de l'emploi garanti ». Vous avez collaboré avec de nombreux gouvernements pour évaluer ou pour concevoir des politiques et des programmes d'emploi sur cette question de la garantie à l'emploi, avec les impacts notamment de ces programmes d'emploi sur les jeunes, les femmes, les inégalités de revenus, la santé des ménages et le bien-être. Donc c'est très important parce que pour nous, c'est un des cœurs de notre projet des pactes des jours heureux. Donc vraiment, un grand merci d'être avec nous. On va, comme on fait d'habitude pour les auditions, vous laisser d'abord la parole pendant plusieurs minutes et puis après vous poser des questions. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Good afternoon. Thank you,
so
Mathilde Panot and members of Parliament and guests for this very kind invitation. I would like to introduce you today to the current thinking in the United States behind the Green New Deal, and specifically on why the job guarantee is in the resolution. If we could just, yep. The Green New Deal resolution that was co-sponsored by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was met with a overwhelming support in the United States. There were approximately 150 senators and representatives that signed onto the resolution. There were 700 individuals and organizations that also supported it, including Greenpeace, 350 org, Fridays for the Future, and very importantly, a youth-led organization called the Sunrise Movement in the United States. Notably, today, as we're in the election cycle, there are over 200 candidates for US office, the national level for Congress, that are running on the Green New Deal resolution. And so today I'd like to just address three key questions. The first is, why did the resolution have such a sweeping response, such broad response to the climate problem that included a series of social and economic policies? The second question is, why specifically the job guarantee was put into the Green New Deal resolution? What is exactly the job guarantee? What function does it serve? And finally, the important question of how do we pay for it? All right. Now, the Paris Accord was perhaps the boldest call for action to address climate change, and the Green New Deal response attempted to meet that challenge. And just to quote from the Accord, the climate justice rests on human rights and the imperative of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. And so the resolution was in large part a response to the call for action, the big call for action, but also it was in part a response to the failure of the current leadership in the United States to abide by the climate accord. There has been, I think, fairly great disappointment among young people and various organizations that we are not taking a leadership role. And so the Green New Deal resolution is not a detailed plan for action, but it is a detailed blueprint for the kind of objectives we need to have in mind as we move toward a green future. So it provides specific guidelines and measures to stem emissions within 10 years, and those include a reduction of emissions of 60%, up to 60% by 2030, and net zero emissions by 2050. It includes specific strategies for moving away from fossil fuels. including a comprehensive social and economic policies for social and economic security. So we are talking about an overhaul of infrastructure, transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture. The goal is to produce 100% clean, renewable, zero-emission energy, and restoring ecosystems, removing greenhouse gases, cleaning hazardous waste sites, as well as ensuring universal access to clean water, energy-efficient housing, training, and education. There is an important recognition that this effort will take place with big contribution of the public sector. And so there needs to be a public ownership stake in some of these investments. And there needs to be a special focus on the frontline communities. By frontline communities, we mean the vulnerable communities that are already experiencing the impact of climate change. We're talking about communities that already have seen the disappearance of jobs, of incomes. They're seeing more precarious economic conditions and happen to also experience the floods and the hurricanes and all of the other climate problems. Within the Green New Deal resolution, there is also a call for guaranteeing a job with a family-sustaining wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacation, retirement, security to all people in the United States. I just want to mention that the components of the Green New Deal itself and the components of the Green New Deal are very popular in the United States. There have been a series of surveys that were conducted over the last 2 years to see what has been the popular support for what is a relatively new idea. And overwhelmingly, Americans are behind this initiative. Up 63%, according to an NPR Marist poll, support the Green New Deal. And of the components of the Green New Deal, virtually all of them have upwards of 50% support, but the job guarantee in particular enjoys 78% support, very broad bipartisan support, with majority support even among conservative and strongly conservative constituencies. So it is very interesting because the job guarantee is not a new idea. It's been reincarnated multiple times during the New Deal in the United States in the 30s, during the Civil Rights Movement. We're now engaged into a national conversation where the job guarantee has captured the imagination of the public, but it is relatively new. And even though the public is not fully aware of what that would involve, it really speaks to some very specific economic anxieties that the population is experiencing, and they're on board with the idea that the public sector, the government, has an important role to play in securing employment, decent employment opportunities to all. Now, the first question is why? Why do we have a climate response that has this panoply of social policy responses as well? And so that is part of the dialogue. Can't we just go ahead and deal with the climate crisis? Can we just go ahead and put in place solutions to the emissions problem? But aren't we muddying the waters and making our jobs much more difficult by adding on a jobs guarantee, so strengthening social security, adding a training and education component, and all of the other social economic policy components? Well, the answer to this question is that there are no purely technical solutions to the climate problem. I think this was what was recognized in the Paris Accord. We can't just solve the environmental problem because every environmental policy is effectively economic policy. Everyone is going to be a social policy. There will be very specific decisions that we need to make about where we put in the investments, what kind of jobs we're creating, how these jobs are remunerated, and what kind of communities we create as we restructure the economy and we transition away from fossil fuel production to clean energy production. And so we need to think about the current economy as one that that perpetuates insecurity on an ongoing basis to certain communities. And in the United States in particular, we have serious problem with air pollution. And I think that that is not just in the United States. We have seen the smog everywhere around the world. We have a problem with the municipal water. Our infrastructure is sorely lacking, and that has been a problem that's been getting worse over the years. There are hundreds of communities that don't have access to clean water. We have something called the food desert problem, where across the United States the only access to food is a convenience store, sometimes even just a gas station, without access to decent, healthy food. And so in a very wealthy nation, we still have patches and patches across the nation of communities that do not have access to decent, healthy food. We also have been experiencing the ravages of fires and hurricanes and droughts that we are observing across the globe, from Australia to Indonesia to Venice, to right here in our backyards, where we have trouble with hazardous wayside, with communities in disrepair, with public infrastructure that is deteriorating, and on and on. So we are really talking about a broad set of problems that are not limited to the loss of wildlife, but that loss of wildlife and habitat also mean the loss of livelihood and of community life, of jobs, etc. And so that, of course, is already causing a whole lot of dislocations. Hurricanes are decimating communities, but we are not repairing them, and not repairing them at least at a fast enough rate. There's a lot of dislocations. There are cities in the United States that are being incinerated. We just saw what happened to Australia, endangering species. And we are exhausting our public resources that have already been under a lot of stress. The public sector has already been under decades of austerity, reducing support for essential public services and essential public investments. And that problem is going to be exacerbated as we see more dislocation, more climate refugees, and more economic insecurity. So I want to just ask the question, as we think about the future, what good is creating clean energy and environmentally sustainable practices if we don't all have access to all? What good is it to have clean energy if we still have people without decent housing? Right? Or if we still have people, at least in the context of the United States, that don't have access to public transportation where they can get to their jobs? What kind of a world would it be if we fixed the labor market, if we provided good jobs, but we continued to rely on exploiting the environment for our well-being? So these are not separate questions, they're one question. And that's why the climate response has to be very, very carefully focused on who benefits and how to remedy the environmental injustices that have already been inflicted on many communities. In the most crucial piece of the Green New Deal resolution is the job guarantee. At least that's what the Atlantic called it in December of 2018. And so I want to introduce you to that policy proposal. What is the jobs guarantee? And why is it there? Okay, so job guarantee is a proposal where the government will act as an employer of last resort, or more specifically as it will provide an employment safety net for those who don't have access to decent basic wage employment opportunities. It's a public option. Okay? We have many public options. The public sector already provides guarantees, basic access to, whether it's education, whether it is to security, whether it is to the public defenders, whether it is public transportation. We have many public options. But this is one public option we have not yet provided. So we understand that when the problem is retirement insecurity, we need to guarantee basic retirement insecurity. And in addition to all of the other ways in which we provide for our retirement. We understand that when the problem is when the issue is access to public education, we guarantee it. We still have private education. We have various other ways of providing for a well-trained, literate society, but there's a public option for education. When the problem is housing insecurity, we guarantee it. We have a policy for providing public housing. But when the issue is absence of jobs, we don't have a similar kind of public option to guarantee that. We do all sorts of things. We try to provide training and education to the unemployed. We provide unemployment insurance. These are essential policies to make sure that people do not fall through the cracks. They live and survive, but the insecurity is a job insecurity problem. And so in a similar way, the job guarantee proposes that we provide a safety net that provides the basic job for the economy as a whole that will be accessible to those who need it. It's a permanent policy. In other words, it's not something we do just in the depths of recessions, because unemployment is with us all the time. And people who need basic, decent work are there even when economies are growing strongly. So it is a public policy that is permanent, but it is federally funded, just like other public options, locally administered. Because the idea is that when we are creating jobs, we want to create them at the places where they're needed for the people who need them. And we mobilize the know-how of the community. We mobilize their work, their infrastructure, the assessment of the problems that exist in those communities to match those needs with the available resources. It is a voluntary program. This is not workfare. We are not requiring people to come and work for their unemployment benefits, right? We are providing them a choice. You can get unemployment benefits. At least in the United States, they expire. They're very small, inadequate benefits, but we also provide a public option for jobs. And so the idea is that we will be reducing the expenditure on all of the costs associated with unemployment by providing the public option. And it is open to anyone who knocks on the door of the unemployment office, and it does not discriminate on the basis of labor market status, race, sex, color, or creed. So the way to think about it, it's a safety net, but it's also a transitional opportunity. We are doing this to allow people who need work, who want work, to transition out of unemployment, especially long-term unemployment, into paid work, to provide not just the employment opportunity, but also the training, education, credentialing that might be necessary to then transition to other better paid employment opportunities. So we can think of it as a stepping stone, this program. Okay. Now, what is it not? As I said, it's not compulsory workfare. It's not a handout. It's not digging ditches and making work. We're truly trying to solve some very specific problems, unemployment being one of them, but also fill in some gaps and needs in the communities. It's not temporary. We also don't believe that every single person has to be working. It is for those who need to work, for those who don't have decent income, but it is within a tapestry. The job guarantee is part of a broader social policy to take care of all of our members of society, those who can work and those who cannot. And so there are other components in the Green New Deal that help with people who are who experience, let's say, disability, might not be able to work, who need to go to school and do not have access to affordable education, for caregivers, etc. Okay, so this is a piece of a broader tapestry of public policies. Okay, it's also not another infrastructure project, just another infrastructure program. It's normal. We normally think of direct employment as putting people to work on infrastructure investment, and we surely, desperately need infrastructure investment. But the issue is, as I will discuss in a moment, unemployment is a very volatile phenomenon, and we need to be able to address it at all times, in good times and bad. And we can't build a bridge every time there's an unemployment person. So we've got to think more creatively about creating jobs. And the vast majority of the jobs of the future are anyway in the service sector. And so Public service employment is normally the focus of the jobs guarantee, and the job guarantee is proposed as a National Care Act where we take care of the environment, of communities, and of people. So we are looking at those specific areas to create some employment opportunities. And I want to say the job guarantee, even in its earlier forms, in its earlier conceptualizations from the New Deal to the Civil Rights Movement to today, has always been green. There has been always a strong emphasis on conservation, renewal, on rehabilitation, and today that aspect of the job guarantee is ever more important. And there are countless of tasks that we can create overnight, including those that do not require very high-skilled work, that are essential tasks that need to be done on an ongoing basis. So if we can continue. So why do we need it? There are several ways to think about why we need the job guarantee. Well, the first one is that unemployment is truly a social and economic epidemic. It's a quiet ailment. Quiet, maybe invisible, but maybe not so invisible social and economic disease that we have so become accustomed to accepting that we have ignored the enormous social and economic costs of unemployment. And economists in particular have ignored those costs. If we look at research from the cognitive sciences, from psychology, from public health, we know that the costs of unemployment are enormous. They include suicide rates, mortality rates. These are permanent effects even after one has experienced a spell of unemployment. We know the devastating effects of an unemployed parent on children, their performance in school, their own health effects, but also those are devastating consequences on partners, spouses, other family members. If we were to add up all of the social costs, going more frequently to the doctor, paying for all these programs, remedial programs to help child outcomes and the sicker and the more disabled, etc., if we add them all up, unemployment is paid over many times. The unemployed are already the charge in the responsibility of the public sector, and we are paying to maintain an ongoing problem that we have not resolved in a direct way. And so the proposition here is that paying to employ people provides greater benefits, social economic benefits, than paying to support unemployment. And so I'm not even counting the loss of output and productivity and all of the other negative effects. The firms don't like to employ the unemployed, right? And we need to break that vicious cycle and that sort of catch-22 that the unemployed experience. Okay, now it is a cruel and ineffective way to stabilize an economy by accepting unemployment as normal. And so I just want to spend just a minute talking a little bit about that. What do I mean by stabilizing the economy by tolerating unemployment? If you notice, the unemployment rate in France is quite volatile. And it's the same in the United States and it's the same in many countries. What that means is that whenever there is a downturn, an economic downturn, firms just lay off en masse a lot of people. And that is a collapsing demand that then the government responds to address. We then provide unemployment insurance, income support, food stamps in the United States. We attempt to stabilize the economy by providing various forms of income support, which is the right thing to do. But we're essentially allowing unemployment to exist and to perpetuate. Because when people lose their work, they don't go to the movies, they don't go to the restaurants, at least not in as much as before. They don't send their kids to summer camp, they reduce their expenditures, and that is a contagion effect that then multiplies through the economy. We want to stop the avalanche effect, right? We want to stop this contagion effect. And so by providing a public option to jobs, a person who is in need of some basic stable work will transition into the public option, will be able to maintain their customary expenditures, to maintain their standard of living, and will then be looking for opportunities to return to better paid work as the economy recovers. But it's the very expenditure on the job guarantee that provides the stimulus that is necessary to grow the economy, and we have full employment. So it is a better way than doing it through unemployment. We know also that central banks watch carefully what the unemployment rate is. They have a concept called the natural unemployment rate, and they worry that if that natural unemployment rate gets too low, that might create inflation, which essentially means too many people have work, too many people would be asking for wage increases, and those wage increases will create price pressures. And so our paradigm, our thinking is such that we do not want to create those good conditions for working families because they might generate inflationary pressures. So we use unemployment, some positive level of unemployment, to stabilize prices. Once again, it's a cruel method of stabilizing the economy when we have an alternative. If we have the employment program, just like unemployment expands in recessions and shrinks in expansions, the public sector employment program will do the same. Except we're not going to have such volatile layoffs. We're going to have smaller fluctuations because it's just a more stable economy. People's spending patterns are much more stable. And so we have the same, what we call counter-cyclical effect that the job guarantee can serve. The bottom line here in this description is that the job guarantee is simply a replacement of unemployment as a stabilizer. We want to eradicate that model of macroeconomic stabilization that is done on the backs of people, especially on the backs of the unemployed. And so we critically want to think about how normal truly is unemployment if we account for all of the social costs, and if we can devise a policy that can stabilize the economy in a more humane way by providing employment at family-sustaining wages, decent wages, then clearly that is the superior policy option. So this is one critical reason why the job guarantee has been proposed as a policy to be part of the public policy, irrespective of the Green New Deal or not. Because even once we clean up the environment, we still are going to have the business cycle, right? That's the heartbeat of the economy. It goes up and down and up and down. And we want to make sure that we do not use unemployment to stabilize an economy. If we can continue. Okay, so I've already discussed that, we want to think about policy that's preventative, not always reactive to crises, and it's much harder to do job creation in the depths of a crisis. It's better to prepare, it's better to plan, and with this policy, we can invest in the public good, in people, communities, and the environment, and we can prevent all of these enormous social, political costs of unemployment. We also guarantee a basic human right. It is part of the human declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is part of many constitutions, especially those that are modeled after the Declaration, and yet this is a mandate that remains unmet.
The French Constitution also
has it,
yeah.
right?
Yes.
Exactly, yeah. And the Spanish constitutions, many constitutions around the world, it's only on the books, but it is a charge. It's our responsibility. It is also important because once we have a job guarantee, we effectively have a fully employed economy where the bulk of employment is in the private sector, but there will be a portion that will be in the bulk of the employment is in the private sector, but a portion will be in the public sector. And the public sector always sets the standard. And this will be the standard for wages. The wage in the job guarantee will be the minimum wage for the entire economy. We have minimum wage legislation today, very important minimum wage legislation, but the wage of an unemployed person is still zero. And so it is not truly effective, firm floor to incomes, because to guarantee a floor, you need two things. You need a minimum wage, but you also need the offer of employment at that wage that is guaranteed. And so in that sense, we lift up the floor and we stabilize income at the bottoms, and we unapologetically say that no person will fall below that minimum income. Now, very briefly, I want to say that in the US, we modeled a very ambitious job guarantee proposal for the United States. And just briefly to overview, it is a policy that has significant positive effects on the economy. It actually boosts the path of growth by about 2 to 3%. It also boosts private sector employment because of the stimulus that it provides and all of the positive social multipliers by 3 to 4 million jobs. And it is a policy that in our estimates could cost up to 1.5% of GDP. When you compare that to other safety nets and other policies, that is, it is quite a small price to pay, and we do not account for all of the savings that the program will generate. We calculated a little bit on unemployment insurance and some of the tax credits the unemployed get, but we did not account for many of the social costs, health costs that are more complicated to factor in. We also found that it improves municipal and state budgets, and it has negligible impact on inflation. Next. I think so. The job guarantee, as I said, has always been green. The important point here is why the job guarantee is in the Green New Deal, is that we want to articulate clearly that there is no conflict between jobs and the climate. Up to now, there has always been an issue of, do we create jobs or are these jobs destroying the environment? And it's a paradox. It's a paradox because as jobs have become harder to come by, as they don't pay as well, but still some of the good jobs are in the fossil fuel sectors, people are resistant to giving up those jobs. They don't know what the transformation will hold. They don't know what the future will bring. The job guarantee says you are guaranteed a place in this transition. We won't simply wipe out your fossil fuel job without providing you with an employment alternative. And so we can skip the slide as well. So I want to say that there are 3 job guarantees in the Green New Deal. The first one is the following. The Green New Deal is a very large-scale response. The climate response is the climate problem is so big that the response required has to be very large scale. In some sense, the climate is, the planet is not insurable. We can't figure out some sort of financing tax mechanism to tax here and pay there. It's a requirement. We have to save the planet. And so it requires the kind of effort that we put in place when we used to fight war. There's no commercial return, right? If anything. It's exactly the opposite. It is the kind of effort that we require to make a Marshall Plan, to reconstruct and rebuild. In some ways, it may even be a little bit better than fighting a war because first of all, we're saving the environment. But second of all, we are changing one civilian production to another civilian production. We don't have to mobilize our resources to fight a war and to fight climate change, right? We're switching the technique of production. But no doubt it will require all manner of know-how, all manner of technique, all hands on deck. It will generate, in our estimation, strong growth and employment opportunities for decades to come. And so this is the industrial strategy part of the job guarantee. That the engineer who works on an oil rig will be an engineer who works in a lab that is developing clean technology. There is also another kind of guarantee. Some jobs simply have to be phased out, right? Mining just has to stop. And so those jobs, there is a guarantee for those people that there will be opportunities in clean infrastructure, installing solar panels or doing other important investments that will require medium skill, But in the conception of the Green New Deal in the US, there is also a guarantee for early retirement, if that is the preferred option, or other opportunities that provide comparable income for fossil fuel workers. So that's the second guarantee, to make sure they are not left behind. Mm-hmm. And the final guarantee is the one that I described. That is the macroeconomic structural reform, the one that has to be there, rain or shine, the one that deals with the most vulnerable amongst us, the ones that will be most quickly displaced in the transformation, usually lower wage, lower skilled workers. But that is also the component that, as I said earlier, should not be discontinued once we have cleaned up the environment. Right? Okay. There are many programs around the world. I will not go over them, but I just want to say that we just have not been thinking in those terms for a long time. But whenever we have tried direct employment, those jobs and programs can be up and running in short order, and they can do a lot of good, both for communities and for the people themselves. Next. And then finally, the big question is, how will we pay for it? Well, how will we pay for the climate? How are we paying for the climate destruction? How are we paying for the fires? How are we paying for the floods that are already decimating the Midwest and Venice? How are we paying for the hurricanes? All of these will get worse and worse. And what that means is that they will require a response by the public sector. And that response will end up being either ad hoc, emergency response, or it will be planned response. And what the Green New Deal is saying, let's plan for all of this. Because we will surely be spending the financial resources, no questions asked, and it will be again more expensive to react to a crisis than to put in place infrastructure investment that will last a long time. I think, again, we gotta invoke how we paid for the war, or how we pay for the financial crisis. Whenever there is a crisis, an emergency, and there's a political will, the finance is suddenly there, right? And so it is hiding in plain sight that money is actually never really the problem, right? If we have commitment to policy priorities and we consider them urgent enough, we mobilize the finance. We may have scarce labor, we may have scarce natural resources, we may have scarce real resources, but finance is never really scarce in a real sense. Finance is actually flexible. So let me just say the following. How do we think about how to pay for this? We have created artificial financial constraints. There's nothing natural about scarce finance. Actually, finance tends to be freely available to the public sector, especially governments which we call monetarily sovereign governments. What that means is that as we have formed our nation states and our institutions, we have formed also the infrastructure to allow public finance as needed. And so sovereign nations, the ones that have their central banks and their treasuries and ministries of finance that coordinate to meet government payments, are those also that tend to issue their own currency. They have their own financial resource. And that tends to be the rule around the world, that there's one nation, one currency. The currency is a monopoly of the public sector, and the public sector has devised also institutions to meet government payments on demand. But here in Europe, we have a major exceptions. By design, we have changed the monetary system. We have by design limited our public space, our policy space. And we have done so by removing monetary sovereignty. It has happened on voluntary basis, right? That abdicating the right and control over the individual nation-state currency, as we have committed to a common currency in the Eurozone. So that has created a couple of problems. The first one is that individual countries no longer can independently control their own budgets in a way that they did before, when they had their own financial resources and before the central banks could coordinate with their treasuries. The second way in which we have limited our policy space is by imposing Maastricht criteria of 3% to GDP. So that's a second limit. So when we think about large-scale response, big, bold action, our institutions in Europe do not provide that support. And we need to think about how to implement a response that may require big deficit spending. It may require investment that is greater than 1% of the European budget, right? So as we talk about the Green New Deal, I think it is very important that we bust another myth, and that is that fear of actually running a deficit when it is necessary. Because that is normal, that is quite a normal condition for any government, irrespective of whether that government is a European government, a member nation of the Eurozone, or it's a government that has its own currency. And if you look at virtually every country, with the exception of some Nordic countries, most governments run deficits. It's just normal. But we have vilified the deficit to such a degree, and we have created this mythology around the public sector. We've identified a government with a household and asked it to behave like one, when we understand the government must behave exactly in a different way. It has to serve a public purpose, not an individual purpose. And so we have a significant challenge. I just want to show you, let me skip this graph, and I just want to show you the next graph, the deficit perspective from France, to say that it's quite normal to have a deficit. And there's a very simple reason why it's normal to have a deficit. The word is very scary, but what a deficit means is that the government spends into the economy more financial resources, more money than it takes back in the form of taxes. That's what a deficit is. So the government provides contracts, income support programs, injects money into the economy, but takes back only a portion in the form of taxes. That's the deficit. But that money stays in the economy, it stays somewhere, right? And so what the deficit is exactly is the mirror image of the non-government surplus. And that's critically important to understand. Because when we say the government deficit is too big, we are also saying that the private sector surplus is too big. When we are saying the government deficit can be below 3%, we are saying the private sector should run a surplus below 3%. Why? What is the economic rationale to do so? And when we're talking about bold government action, we may need a deficit that is larger than 3%. We have seen this time and time again. European member nations breach the 3% all the time. And it's sometimes, very often, it's beyond their control. The economy has slowed down, tax revenue has declined, automatic government expenditures have increased. Naturally, the deficit expands. That is the counter-cyclical stabilizer. It is by design, it has a very important function. And so by structurally trying to rein it in and reduce it, we are essentially cutting important programs in the depths of a recession, and that is precisely the opposite thing that we need to do. So we need to give up our fear of the deficit. We need to understand that it's quite normal, that it serves an important macroeconomic stabilization function, and that 3% in and of itself does not have an economic rationale. And in fact, we may need very soon to loosen that limit if we come upon a next crisis. The deficit has a mind of its own. We cannot really control it. You know? Yeah. Do you have a question, or just one more thing to finish? Okay, and the last thing is, so I'm just going to invoke Jacques Rueff, the French economist that said Europe will be created via currency or not at all. And I think that the important point here is finishing the job. We have to finish the job. We cannot have a monetary union without having a proper fiscal union and a proper fiscal policy, that we have a net spender of significant size to stabilize the Eurozone as a whole. And that requires fixing our institutions, that requires not just maybe a treasury or big budget, but it requires carefully thinking about fiscal policy that will be counter-cyclical and that will have large enough budget to accommodate these investments that we deem important for the Eurozone as a whole. And the Green New Deal is a moment of opportunity, and the job guarantee is a moment of opportunity to push us in that direction, to start thinking about how big, what nature of the response how we need to craft the response, and how to create policies for, if you will, macroeconomic integration and social integration that will benefit all member nations. And with that, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. And
Thank you.
we have a time, I think, about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Around.
Okay.
15
10 minutes for
a
questions.
round of questions.
Yeah.
Mathilde, you want to start?
Très rapidement, déjà merci, ça fait du bien d'entendre ce discours-là, au moment où on fait la chasse aux chômeurs quand même en France.
Oui.
On a des questions très précises. Peut-être commencer par la première. La garantie à l'emploi, sur quelle base financière est-elle basée? Est-ce que c'est sur des cotisations ou est-ce que c'est sur de la fiscalité
So the first question is job guarantee. It's well, but how is it funded? Is it based on taxation or is it part of wages that are socialized and that are real for the payment?
So the proposal is for federal funding, which means that it's funded by appropriation. What we say in the United States is that we can do that without increasing taxes to match the expenditure. In fact, that's partly important to do that because the job guarantee is counter-cyclical. If we attempt to match taxes with funding, it never works anyway because the government is always in a deficit position because it tends to spend more than it taxes back. But also, it's counter-cyclical. We need to spend more than we take out of the economy in the depths of a recession. So the budget is largely determined on its own devices anyway. So what we want is to allow the budget to serve this counter-cyclical function, and the job guarantee is funded just through federal appropriation, direct federal appropriation.
Okay, so you mean it's part of the program in the budget that is voted,
Yes.
and then we'll know that we
That's
got
right.
this, and if we need more, we can vote more in an addendum to the budget. So
I think exactly.
global budget.
That's right. I think that's really the critical function because sometimes a recession might be worse than we expected. We need to find a way to appropriate more funding for directly employing the unemployed. By attempting to increase taxes in the depths of a recession, what one hand gives, the other hand takes away, and it doesn't serve the counter-cyclical function that we want.
Deuxième question qui est importante, c'est qui décide de l'affectation des besoins? Comment ça se passe? Est-ce qu'il y a un répertoire limité d'emplois? Est-ce qu'il y a un secteur géographique délimité aussi pour ces créations d'emplois? Et comment on décide l'organisation des besoins?
So who decides the needs? By that, she means who decides the kind of job that is on offer, which kind of job, but also on what geographical basis?
Mm-hmm. There are several models of implementation, but we strongly prefer a decentralized model of design that has participatory component, where the communities and members of the community propose to the Ministry of Labor or the government the kind of projects that they think they're required in those communities. We've seen that done across the world, and it's quite effective. Also, it really speaks to this idea of frontline communities, that we want to incorporate their voice, their needs, their specific understanding of what must be done in those communities, but also it helps with the targeted approach. It's perhaps not so easy for a federal government employee to go to a distressed area and then coordinate employment opportunities, where those who live there and know exactly what they experience and exactly what their needs are much better suited at designing projects that can be effective and that can survive.
Juste, si je me permets d'ajouter, parce qu'on travaille justement sur une proposition de loi. We've been working on a bill that is focusing on how do we organize this structure from the local to the national level, which will put together communities, even trade unions, and the national government. And my question to you will be on this specific aspect. There will be need to decide and the voting power of those people, and if there is a veto, for instance, from the community. It's a very democratic question also that is very important for us. La question de la démocratie et de qui décide en dernier ressort de l'allocation des besoins et des emplois.
What is like the Latin sense of the jobs?
Yes, it's even how we. To us, the Green New Deal process has to be very democratic, and people should choose and decide whether it's okay or not to have those jobs, and so we have to think also the administrative structure of all that with the democratic components.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I think it's crucial for its success, so that we know that these are really useful projects and people have a stake in them, and they fortify the community. I think it is important to stress that because it's a federal program, the final responsibility rests with the, let's say, Ministry of Labor. What our objective is clearly to make sure that every community has begun the process of creating job lists and project lists to address unemployment there. So it is really ultimately the responsibility of the public sector that provides the public option, that everyone who shows up at the unemployment office has that opportunity. But the unemployment offices, at least in the United States, are scattered in every county. They already do very important work. But what they don't have is job lists. So they provide training, they provide lots of additional services that are important, but the jobs are not there. And so we need to add this final component where it's the unemployment center could be the repository of the employment options. They could be the jobs bank, where they solicit to local members, non-profits, community groups, even cooperatives, and say, please propose projects that you believe are essential. How many people would we need for them? Keep the job list, and as the unemployed come in, we match as best as we can.
Okay. Yeah, that was my question. So the matching structure in the Ministry of Labor. Projects come, unemployed people come, and the matching is organized within the walls of the Ministry of Labor.
I think that maybe not so. Maybe the employment office would be charged with that, but the Ministry of Labor, I think, needs to provide the broad guidelines and also the law, right? Compliance, like, what kind of, are you following all labor law, and you're creating safe conditions and all of that. So, using the customary channels of just making sure these are good jobs.
But the local communities do not choose the people to recruit. So this is made within the public employment service.
Well, I mean, if you are a community center that needs certain environmental work, you are staffed, you take the people who are from the unemployed office, because the program says it is a public purpose to provide employment to the unemployed. So that's what you're doing. You have a whole bunch of projects that have been understaffed, and you take from the pool of the unemployed to staff them. And so there will be some local level matching at the administrative office, surely. Some sort of administration that I think is more local would probably be better to match. Yes.
Autre question importante, comment dans les différentes expériences que vous avez vues, est-ce qu'il y a un effet négatif ou des choses auxquelles il faut faire attention pour pas qu'il y ait concurrence entre des besoins? Typiquement, s'il y a des besoins, là on donnait l'exemple de réparateurs de fenêtres, comment on fait pour pas que ça mette au chômage en fait les gens qui font ça dans les entreprises privées, et avec la question des fonctionnaires aussi en France.
So are there negative externalities in the sense that this job funded by the state through the job guarantee scheme could be competing with other private sector jobs, or even in the public sectors with good civil servant jobs? So how do you organize that there is no competition at that level?
So there are two aspects. The first is the public sector aspect. It's very important in the way we conceptualize the program that's a separate program. It is not a program to displace public sector workers. Very important, because public sector, traditional, regular public sector work has to be done at all times. It's not cyclical work. And we need specific know-how, skill, expertise. We cannot get food inspectors and drug inspectors from the ranks of the unemployed. And we have to be very careful not to displace those public sector workers. So this is why the program is conceptualized as a separate program. There is no displacement effects. You know, there are provisions that you can make to make sure that these are not. So that has to be clearly spelled out in the legislation. And it's a program that eliminates unemployment. The focus is that we do not allow the existence of unemployment, not that we are using this project to fulfill specific public sector needs. The second thing is the private sector. It's a little more complicated relationship with the private sector, because some of the pressure, we do want the private sector to feel some pressure, in the sense that the private sector is using effectively unemployment to bargain, reduce various benefits, employment benefits, wages in the private sector. This policy wants to be the floor for all wages. So in a sense, it does say, if you're an employer that pays poverty wages, you have to compete. You have to compete. So it is a feature of the policy to make sure there's a living wage floor, or at least minimum decent wage floor for all. We have to be careful how we implement it, so that the disruption effect is not too big and the firms are able to adjust. In the US, cities and states have living wages that are higher than the minimum wage. They increase them, the private sector has to adjust, and they do adjust. And so in a similar way, how the wage structure is phased in can allow the private firms to match this in the least disruptive way possible.
One aspect we've been thinking when drafting the bill is also to say that we want to focus on local private sector, in the sense that we care about local companies, locally owned, small size companies, and to have this positive effect on them, as you say, whether it's wages, but because people would be in activities, they will be able to spend and stuff like that. Right. So we care about small owned companies and that help the community, and we want to end this in the sense it will help them also.
And there are two ways in which we can help them. One, at least in our model, which we use a very traditional, very widely used macro model for the US, we find strong demand effects. And we find the private sector increases its employment as a consequence. But another way which we could help private firms is by using apprenticeship programs. The majority of the job guarantee is public service employment. First, because it's not really for profit, because it's a public option. Like that's the goal. But in part because the public services also have been deteriorated over time. But for young people, there are effective apprenticeship programs that are training, on-the-job training programs, that then young people are being transitioned into those private firms, and they have certain certainty who they're getting. And so the transition component is strengthened by using youth apprenticeship. So in a continent where youth unemployment is very high, I think that it's something to think about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just one question, if you have the time. I was just wondering how would you explain the fact that, like, in America, the Green New Deal seems to enjoy a very high approval rate, when at the same time, the president also enjoys a high approval rate, when he's very much in denial and very much against it. So how do you explain those two things? That seems to be like a paradox? Because we could have the same thing here in France, so that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. So the Green New Deal, I think in the United States, people are starved for big, bold policies. And I think that in part explains the success of Trump, because there has been a lot of talk about big, bold changes. Whether they have happened or not is a different matter. But people are starved for a different kind of conversation. And especially the anxiety around work and wages has been very high, even as unemployment has declined very, very quickly. The Green New Deal has this strong component of we will rebuild these communities that have seen their economic life disappear for a long, long time. We will bring jobs and employment. It's going to be clean. People know what happens. They turn on the faucet, brown water comes through. They know. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. And so the fact that it provides a vision and provides a sense of certainty, at least on the paper, on books, that we will pay attention to your specific problems. We will make sure that you are brought into the transition is what is this paradox. And so, yes, there's a strong working class, I would say, constituency that has turned to Trump in the absence of an alternative vision. And the Green New Deal came as a response to us pulling out of the climate accord and saying, no, the next generation does not believe in this. They demand bigger, bolder action.
Yeah. And one last question, Adam?
Yes, one last question is, should we pay specific attention to turnover with the risk of people being 2 or 3 months within a program and then finding a new job in the private sector? And how do we organize that?
Yeah. I think that there are a lot of environmental projects that can take the turnover, especially invisible environmental work like monitoring of species, invisible, doing some rehabilitation of spaces. They can take many hands or fewer hands. They can be postponed. So I think that's why the green aspect has been successful even for the small infrastructure projects. I believe that the job guarantee has to be careful, again, not to displace essential work. If it turns out, as I said, the food desert in the US, if it turns out that this has to be a permanent infrastructure in the United States, that we want to have the community gardens as a permanent infrastructure and have minimum staffing, then that becomes part of the mainline public sector. But those community gardens can bring in people and they can leave and come and go as needed depending on the cycle.
And on the agricultural part, because I think there needs to be job created in the agricultural sector, it's also seasonal work. So you can have a process where this network provides the seasonal work that is needed.
Yeah.
If it's needed in addition to the infrastructure that is in place for the green agricultural revolution.
Yeah, absolutely, especially if we focus on locally sourced, sustainable agriculture, greenhouses, things that can be operated, urban fisheries, things that can operate on an ongoing basis. That can be one way of addressing the seasonality. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We would have a lot more questions, but
Thank
this is very insightful and helpful. And it shows also that there's an international network and work that is being built right now, and it's very important also to add. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation, the question. Pleasure. Thank you.